Everybody Loves Raymond ran for 9 seasons and became one of the most beloved sitcoms in television history, largely because it didn't feel like a typical sitcom at all. There were no wacky neighbors, no far-fetched plots, no laugh-track-friendly gimmicks, just a married couple, meddling parents, and the exhausting, funny, occasionally infuriating reality of family life. That grounded quality wasn't an accident. Creator Phil Rosenthal built the show almost entirely out of his own life, and the cast brought that authenticity to the screen in ways audiences didn't always realize. Long after it left the air, the show still resonates with viewers precisely because it never chased trends or gimmicks. It simply told the truth about family, one uncomfortable dinner table conversation at a time. Here are 20 facts about the making of Everybody Loves Raymond that reveal just how personal and how real this family sitcom actually was. Long before Everybody Loves Raymond existed, Phil Rosenthal was simply a writer navigating the universal chaos of overbearing parents, a spouse who needed space, and the way family dynamics never really disappear even after you've moved out and started your own household. Rosenthal has spoken openly in interviews and in the documentary Exporting Raymond about how closely the show mirrored his real relationships, particularly with his own parents. Rather than inventing a fictional family from scratch, he leaned into the specific, sometimes uncomfortable truths of his own life, betting that audiences would recognize themselves in the details even if the Baroness weren't literally their family. Before he became one of television's most recognizable sitcom leads, Ray Romano was a working stand-up comedian who built his act around observations on marriage, parenthood, and everyday domestic frustration. He was discovered largely through a national television appearance that caught the attention of producers looking for someone who could believably anchor a show about ordinary family life. Romano had little formal acting experience going into the role, and by his own accounts, adjusting to a scripted, multi-camera sitcom environment took real time and effort. Hitting marks, memorizing pages of dialogue, and performing the same scene multiple times for different camera angles were all foreign skills compared to the freedom of a stand-up stage. What made him work in the role wasn't polished technique. It was that his comedic voice already sounded like the character he was being asked to play, which meant the writers could lean into his natural rhythms rather than asking him to imitate someone else's idea of a sitcom dad. Much of the show's humor came from small, specific, lived-in details rather than broad sitcom setups, the particular way an overbearing parent guilt-trips their adult child, or the quiet exhaustion of a spouse trying to keep the peace at a family dinner. Rosenthal has said in interviews that these moments were drawn directly from his own experience and observations of family life, which is part of why the show's version of family tension felt uncomfortably familiar to so many viewers rather than exaggerated for comic effect. Doris Roberts came from a background in stage acting, known for disciplined preparation, while Peter Boyle had a reputation for a looser, more instinctive approach to performance. Those differing styles, by many accounts from cast and crew over the years, occasionally created friction in how scenes were approached and rehearsed, since a performer who wants everything locked down in advance and one who prefers to discover moments in the moment don't always rehearse the same way. Whatever tension existed between their working methods, it never got in the way of what ended up on screen. Their chemistry as Marie and Frank Barone, a couple worn down by decades of routine and low-grade bickering, became one of the show's most consistently funny elements, and audiences never had any trouble believing these two had been married for 40 years. Casting the role of Deborah Barone reportedly took some trial and error, since the character needed to be sympathetic without becoming a pushover, and sharp without becoming simply the nagging wife trope so common in sitcoms of the era. Patricia Heaton, who had been working steadily in television without a major breakout role, brought a specific balance to her audition, playing Deborah as someone who genuinely loved her husband but was worn thin by his family's constant intrusion. That balance is largely credited with making the character, and the marriage at the center of the show, feel believable rather than one-note. Garrett has spoken publicly about how the character of Robert Barone, the overlooked older brother constantly living in Raymond's shadow, felt frustrating to play in the show's earliest episodes, when much of his material leaned on the character simply being the butt of the joke. As the writing developed Robert into a more layered character, competent in his career, capable of real romantic storylines, occasionally allowed to win, Garrett has said the role became more rewarding, eventually turning Robert into one of the show's most sympathetic and well-loved characters rather than just comic relief. Michael and Jeffrey Barone were portrayed by real twins, Sawyer and Sullivan Sweeten, who grew up on the show alongside their older sister, Madeline Sweeten, who played Ally. Casting actual siblings for a family sitcom is a common industry strategy, since real siblings tend to have an easy, believable physicality with each other that's harder to fake between unrelated child actors. Directing very young child actors on a multi-camera sitcom schedule presented real challenges in the early seasons, but as the boys grew older, their performances matured along with them, and by the show's later seasons they were seasoned, comfortable young performers who'd essentially grown up on set. Sadly, Sawyer Sweeten passed away in 2015 at the age of 19. His loss was deeply felt by his castmates and by fans who had, in a sense, watched him grow up on screen over 9 seasons of television. Romano has talked in interviews about how he'd often take scripts home and tweak his own lines, not because the writing was poor, but because he wanted the rhythm and phrasing to sound like something he'd actually say rather than something written for a character. Over time, the writers grew accustomed to his voice and began crafting Raymond's dialogue with Romano's natural cadence already in mind, which helped the character feel less like a scripted sitcom dad and more like an extension of Romano's own comedic sensibility. Everybody Loves Raymond premiered in the fall of 1996 to modest, unremarkable ratings, and for a stretch of its first season, its renewal was genuinely uncertain. CBS experimented with moving the show around its schedule to find an audience, a common fate for quieter, character-driven comedies going up against flashier programming. It wasn't until the network paired it with a stronger lead-in program that ratings began to climb significantly, giving the show room to build the loyal audience that would eventually make it one of the network's most dependable comedies for nearly a decade. It's a reminder that even shows now remembered as sure-thing classics often needed a bit of scheduling luck to survive their first year. Roberts played Marie Barone for the entire run of the series and won multiple Emmy Awards for the performance, becoming one of the show's most celebrated cast members. She was also well known off-screen as an advocate against ageism in Hollywood, testifying before Congress on the subject during the show's run, a reminder that her public identity extended well beyond the meddling, overbearing character she played so memorably on screen. Before joining Everybody Loves Raymond, Boyle had an extensive career in film, including a well-known role in Young Frankenstein. Taking on a multi-camera sitcom later in his career was something of a shift, and Boyle has spoken about approaching Frank Barone with a performer's instinct for spontaneity rather than heavy over-preparation, which contributed to a looser, reactive comic energy in many of his scenes. Rosenthal has been candid in interviews about how closely Frank and Marie Barone were shaped by his real parents, Max and Helen Rosenthal, down to specific speech patterns and habits. His parents were aware of the connection, and their reactions to seeing themselves reflected on national television, ranging from amusement to occasional discomfort, became part of the show's own mythology, later explored directly in the 2010 documentary Exporting Raymond, which followed Rosenthal as he tried to adapt the format for Russian television. Heaton has spoken about how her working relationship with Romano took time to develop into the close professional bond fans might assume existed from day one. Like many television partnerships, their rapport grew over the course of several seasons of working together, eventually becoming a genuine friendship that lasted well beyond the show's run and carried into their continued collaborations and public appearances together. Rather than building toward a big, dramatic send-off, the final episode of Everybody Loves Raymond, which aired in 2005, ended on a deliberately quiet, low-key note centered around the family simply being together. Many long-running sitcoms of that era leaned into oversized finales, weddings, big speeches, life-altering announcements, but Rosenthal has said the goal here was to avoid an overly sentimental send-off in favor of something that felt true to the show's tone. It was a reminder that the Baroness story wasn't really about big events, but about the ordinary, repetitive rhythms of family life that had defined the series from its very first episode, and ending it any other way would have felt like a betrayal of everything the show had built. After ending its original run, Everybody Loves Raymond found an enormous second life in syndicated reruns, airing multiple times a day across numerous networks and local stations for years afterward. Its comfort viewing appeal made it one of the most successful sitcoms in syndication history, generating substantial ongoing revenue well beyond what the show earned during its initial 9-season broadcast run, a pattern common to many highly rewatchable family sitcoms of that era. Unlike shows built around serialized plots or big twists, Raymond's episodic, self-contained format made it easy to drop into at any point, which is part of why it became such reliable, repeatable programming for stations looking to fill afternoon and evening time slots for years after it stopped producing new episodes. Roberts has spoken about pushing back against notes that would have softened Marie into a more conventionally likable character. Her belief, shared by Rosenthal, was that Marie's overbearing, occasionally infuriating qualities were essential to the character's honesty. Real parents, especially real mothers in that archetype, don't always recognize their own overreach, and smoothing that out would have undercut what made the character funny and true to life in the first place. Even as Everybody Loves Raymond became a hit, Romano continued performing stand-up comedy throughout much of the show's run, using his television success to reach larger audiences on stage rather than stepping away from live performance entirely. That dual career path reflected his roots as a comedian first, giving him a creative outlet separate from the demands of a weekly scripted series. In his later years, Boyle dealt with serious health issues, including a stroke earlier in the 2000s from which he largely recovered enough to continue acting. He remained a steady presence on the show through its final seasons. He passed away in December 2006, a little over a year after the series concluded, and is remembered by his castmates as someone who brought both craft and warmth to a role that could easily have been played as a one-note grump. Across its run, Everybody Loves Raymond received numerous Emmy nominations and wins, including recognition for Doris Roberts, Brad Garrett, Patricia Heaton, and the writing staff, along with a Primetime Emmy for Outstanding Comedy Series. That kind of sustained ensemble-wide recognition is relatively rare for a sitcom that leans so heavily on quiet, dialogue-driven scenes rather than flashy set pieces, and it speaks to how consistently the writing and performances held up season after season. That sustained critical acclaim, paired with strong ratings, is part of why the show is still frequently cited today as one of the best-written American sitcoms of its era. Even after 9 seasons and hundreds of episodes, Rosenthal has continued to describe Everybody Loves Raymond as fundamentally autobiographical, less a workplace sitcom formula than an ongoing attempt to make sense of his own family through comedy. He said in various interviews that the show never stopped being a way of processing his real relationships, even as it grew into a massive commercial success watched by millions of households every week. That personal foundation is part of why the show has aged so well. It wasn't built around topical jokes or pop culture references designed to date quickly, but around the kind of universal family tension that doesn't really go out of style, whether you're watching it in 1996 or decades later. Everybody Loves Raymond may have looked, on the surface, like a straightforward family sitcom, but its lasting power came from how honestly it mined real relationships for comedy. From Rosenthal's own upbringing to the cast's evolving chemistry both on and off screen, the show's 9 seasons were built on small, true details rather than exaggerated sitcom logic. It never needed a gimmick, a twist, or a shocking cliffhanger to keep people watching. It simply trusted that a well-observed family dinner was interesting enough on its own. That's likely why it still resonates with audiences decades later, still airs in reruns around the world, and still gets discovered by new viewers who weren't even born when it first premiered, because underneath the punchlines was something almost everyone recognizes. Family is exhausting, occasionally maddening, and somehow, impossible not to love anyway. Which of these facts surprised you the most? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more.